Good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you very much for your patience. What we have today, first this morning, is a webinar on IPA with two great presenters, actually, Richard Stout and Jeff House. And I'm going to hand over to them in just a minute. First, I want to point out that we are attempting to produce 6 live webinars today. So if you like this one, I recommend you check out some of the others. We've got some great content coming at you. Some housekeeping notes. First of all, you should be able to toggle your screen between the video and the presentation to make it larger or bigger, whichever is more convenient for you. Second of all attendees are able to ask questions through the GoToMeeting module. If you type them into the questions or chat boxes, we'll try to ask them as time allows. We may save some for the end, but we'll try to cover them all. And thirdly, we will be recording this webinar. This presentation is not very bullet intensive. But we'll hopefully have it up on YouTube in a few days and out to you so you can rewatch or share. And with that, very excited to leave you with Mr. Richard Stout and Mr. Jeff House. Thank you, guys.
Hey, thank you. Woo. Thanks, Keith.
Good morning.
Hey. All right, thanks for attending, everybody. I have a lot of content to share this morning. I'm really excited. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about in the Lawson world. So let's go ahead and dive in. My name is Richard Stout. This is Jeff House.
Good morning.
We are RPI consultants. We are 40+ strong. We are a full-service Lawson firm, and I am proud to be a member of the Lawson technical practice, where we do upgrades, 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 landmark IPA, and more upgrades. Today's agenda, we're going to start by talking about one of the most common and useful things you can do with IPA, and that is transaction approval. Right? IPA is tightly bound into the Lawson application. It makes sense that it's a great engine for doing transaction approval.
And then I'm going to talk about using IPA for interfaces, replacing some of your COBOL interfaces with IPA.
Cool. And then we'll get a bit into the architecture of how IPA works. What does Landmark look like? We'll talk a little bit about some of my favorite things and a couple of gotchas to look out for. And finally, we'll wrap it up with how to get from PFI to IPA, a topic that a lot of people are interested in, what with their 10 upgrade on the horizon. Do feel free to ask a lot of questions in the questions box, and my producer, Roz, will interrupt me with any questions that we can answer during the presentation. All right, so let's just go right in.
Thank you, Fraser.
Roz doesn't know the reference. Let's just talk about the IPA for transaction approval. Yeah? You need to stand over here. All right. RQC, requisitions, is probably most people's introduction to process flow or process automation. So let's just talk through what a requisition approval scenario looks like in IPA. From an end user's perspective, we start at the requester who goes into RQC and releases a rec. The rec is then going to say status needs approval. What happens from there is our flow kicks into gear and gets an email notification out to the first approver. Right here I want to point out one of the exciting new features in IPA, something that's been asked for a lot, and it's a big improvement over process flow. It's the ability to approve right from the email notification. Basically, what you see here is at the bottom of my email, I've got links for approve, unrelease, and reject. And our approver can basically just click one of those links and be done with the transaction. It saves the time of going into the in basket. If I click on this link, that will take me to basically just pops up a browser window pointing at the Landmark server, and that processes the action. Here I see my action approve has been processed. Of course, you don't have to approve through email. You still have the web-based in-basket available. Here's a screenshot of the in-basket in the latest version of IPA 10.1.1. You can see it looks a bit different from the process flow in basket. I think it looks better. I think the functionality is improved, but it's a little bit different. But at its heart, you still can go in, see what you have waiting for you for approval, see some details on those transactions, and then take action. I do maybe want to flip back to the email notification for a sec to point out that in process flow, it's common to have email notifications for your approvers that basically just direct your approver to say, go into the web-based in-basket and take a look. You have something that's waiting for your approval. Now that we've given the approvers the ability to approve right from the email, it's extra important to put even more information about the transaction they're looking to approve right here, so we have a slow connection. So that way, the approver can see what's going on with this transaction. So this is an example email that's sent out to an approver. It's got some information about the requisition header up at the top. We have a listing of all the lines on the rec along with GL coding. And then finally, we have a section of message history. I'm going to talk a little bit about this later in the presentation. But we have a capability in IPA called work unit messaging, which just allows us to store some information along with that work unit. I like to use it to form an ongoing audit log of the approval process. All right, so moving forward, we took a look at the web-based in-basket. We can see here that after clicking approve on my requisition, that sent that notification back to the flow. The flow maybe saw that I'm final approver for this rec based on our business logic and our dollars amount, and we mark that requisition as processed. It's now ready to be converted into a purchase order. So how does that work behind the scenes? A requisition approval flow can be as simple as just a couple of nodes. I've got a user action node, which powers my in-basket and my approval notifications. And I've got a Lawson AGS call hitting RQ13, which is what tells the Lawson application the status of the approval. But a more real-world example probably looks something like this, because obviously, if it were that simple, it would be baked-in functionality, right? I mean, every organization has their own rules for approval. I just want to show how easy is it to get that email approval capability in. They've just added a simple checkbox at the bottom of the screen. What I've done here is I've gone into the IPA designer, I've clicked on my user action node, I've gone to the notify tab, I've edited the message, and right at the bottom of that screen you'll see a checkbox to allow actions via email. This will automatically bring in those links at the bottom of the email. Now that's done with some HTML tags. There are CSS classes attached to those tags, so you do have control over the formatting. You can change the CSS in the message. Of course, the body of my message is also going to be HTML, and that's how I have those nice tables set up to show the transaction details. So let's talk a little bit about the approval matrix. This is probably one of the biggest decisions when it comes to designing a flow for approval, is deciding where do we want to store the approvers for this particular type of transaction. And you definitely got a lot of options. When I'm designing a flow, I usually see if it's possible to leverage an existing approval matrix that's already available in the organization, rather than maintaining something separate on the side, right? So how can we do that? Well, some organizations might want to use the HR org chart. IPA makes it real easy to do that. There's a node, a HCM user action node, that lets you do that. So if you're using Lawson HR and you can take advantage of the org chart, that makes it pretty easy to do right within the flow. What else can we do is we can maybe integrate with another system. Maybe you have an external HR system, or another workflow engine that's doing approvals. Maybe you've got invoice approvals set up in your document imaging system, and you already have an approval matrix there. IPA can reach out to other systems with database calls or other methods, and it's not too difficult to take advantage of another approval matrix in a other part of Lawson or a non-Lawson system. Another option, like for requisitions, what we've seen, some organizations like to use the RQO2 screen. RQO2 is just a handy place to be able to store approvals by approval code, and you can tie that approval code back to a requesting location. So that's a good place to store some approval information. But IPA itself has its own data structure where you can hold approvers, and that's called tasks and filter categories. It was available in process flow as well. I think IPA, it's a bit improved mainly because of the user interface you use to go and maintain that. I think that was very difficult information to maintain in process flow, and they made it a lot easier in IPA. So let's take a look at a screenshot of the rich client here. The rich client is your main administrative interface to IPA. So this is where system administrators would go to manage all aspects of the approval system. Here we're taking a look at the tasks page. This lists all of the tasks I have defined. This is user defined. You go and build your own tasks. Tasks generally equates to a level of approval. So sometimes they are named by titles, manager, director, VP, what have you. And here I've just called them level 1, level 2, and level 3. Clicked on level 1 here, and we see at the bottom left all the users that are assigned to that level. And then we can see which locations these particular users approve for. So here I've got my approver, Richard Stout, assigned a level 1 task, and my filter category is by requesting location. I only see items for requesting location RT1 here. Do stop me if any questions. Let's talk about let's talk a little bit about how this would set up in a flow. So generally, yeah, you would have multiple levels of approval set up, and my recommendation is that when you are building out your flow, you're designing your flow, try to avoid duplicating out all of those user actions. If you have 6 levels of approval, I think probably the most basic way to set up a flow is to build out 6 user actions, 1 for each level. But that can cause a lot of duplicated effort when it comes to maintenance. If you want to change change some of the wording in an approval email, that's 6 different places to go and maintain that. So I'd recommend trying to get all of that packaged into a loop. You've got
almost like a subroutine.
Almost like a subroutine, yeah, absolutely, yeah, because that way you can take advantage of repetitive code and make your flow easier to maintain. Come on, buddy. All right. Should we talk a little bit about how flows get started?
Okay.
So approval flows are generally going to be started by trigger. And what that means is you have a business event in your Lawson application, and that with that particular event is going to initiate a flow. They call that a trigger, and there are about 100 or so triggers baked into 4GL code. Obviously, rec approval is one of them. If you're interested in what the other triggers are, it's documented right here. Here I have the landmark info center up, and you can see you can go right into the landmark developer guides and IPA services guide and browse through what all the triggers are. If you're thinking about setting up approval for a transaction, that's the first thing you want to do is take a look at the trigger documentation. It's possible to do approval for a transaction that doesn't have a built-in trigger. It's just more difficult because you have to create the trigger yourself. So it's a bit of customization either in 4GL or with Design Studio. So let's talk a little bit about approver security requirements. This is what different security pieces does a user need in order to be an approver. It's a bit more expanded than process flow. With process flow, you needed WF user equals 1 on your RM record, and you needed to be able to have inquiry access on some WF tables and Logan, like WF variable. And of course, you need inquiry access to see the transaction you're going to approve. That's important for the in-basket, right? So if you're taking a look at a requisition in basket and you want to see details of that requisition, the approver's user account needs inquiry into the RQ tables. With IPA, that expands a bit. We have some security requirements over on the landmark side as well. There is a role over there to get you access. It comes with a system. It's called in-basket user ST that can be customized. You're going to want to make sure that all of your actor records are populated with email addresses because that is how IPA knows who to send those approver emails to. And finally, you need a user record over in IPA. So in IPA has product lines. That's different from process flow. So in the actual product line that corresponds to your Lawson product line, there's a screen there, the table's PFI profile. You need a record in there. That's a lot. That's a lot to get set up and check off for an individual user. If just one of these things is missing, the approver is not going to have a good experience. So my recommendation is build this logic into your approval flow itself, right? Before going into a user action node, use some landmark transactions, some RM queries to check and make sure that all of these items are checked off for that particular user account. And if anything's missing, you can go ahead and fix that right in the flow. Right? That's one of the most powerful uses of IPA is you can go in and modify security or change the security attributes of a user. So we can make sure that all your approver users are provisioned on the fly by building that logic right into the flow. All right, so let's change gears a little bit.
We're going to go into interfaces.
Here, I'll hand you the clicker.
Thank you. So we're going to talk about being able to use IPA for some of your interfaces.
There you go.
It would help if I had the remote the right way and not backwards. I'm left-handed. Give me a break. Okay. So there are several different nodes within IPA that you can use to leverage it. So what kinds of information would you want to interface using IPA? Perhaps you might bring in AP invoices. You could bring in new employees. You could bring in GL transactions. Really just about anything that you can think of, either coming from a separate database, maybe it's coming in as a flat file. And think about, let's talk flat files for just a moment. If you had a flat file before and you were going to bring it into Lawson, what would you have to do? Normally you would have to either use add-ins and manually upload it, or maybe you might have some custom COBOL development where you're going to have this program that runs and it's scheduled. But wouldn't it be nice if we could just have the file somewhere? Maybe we can go get it and read the data and then have it interface into Lawson without us even thinking about it. We can do that with IPA. And you can see on here some of the nodes that we might use are Lawson transactions, landmark, the web run, extremely powerful. Not only can you submit jobs with it, but you can also go out and make any web call to any particular web server and pull back some data. Very, very powerful stuff. So how can we get to our separate systems? Using databases, even outside of Lawson. Let's say we have, maybe we're an AIX Oracle shop, and we need to go out to a SQL Server database that we have internally, maybe for something that for our internal approval. We have some other process. We want to leverage it. We can do that. We can configure the JDBC driver for SQL, go out and read in that database, and then perform a transaction within Lawson.
Yeah,
it's great. It's good stuff. A web service. Maybe we want to do address validation for our new employees to make sure that the address that we have matches what the post office has. Post office has a pretty terrific web service. We can go out, get that information, and validate it against the address, and even update the address that we have within HR11. We also have the ability to FTP now. Yes. So we can actually go out to another server with FTP. Before, we might have had to kind of trick it a little bit and have some sort of special script out on the server that we would
like
have to
a
run.
syscommand.
With a syscommand, exactly.
Yeah.
But now we have FTP built in, including secure FTP.
Oh, great. That's yeah, it's really important for a lot of organizations to have that SFTP capability as well.
Absolutely. So if our file resides on another server, we don't have to worry about getting it to our Lawson server. We can go out and pull, and then do with the file what we want. So now, if we want to trigger this, we said, well, what would happen if a file just magically appeared on my server? Can I pick it up? And if anybody remembers the old scan file client days, we would have to do some configuration, and it would run, and it would pick it up on the directory. But now with IPA, it's so much easier with the file channels. We can configure a channel to look at a specific directory on our server, and when that file, using either an individual file name, or we can use wildcards, it could be any file in a directory, or it could match a pattern, we can read in that file, it's going to archive it, and then we can go in and read the contents of the file and parse it and do what we want to get it into Lawson. So much easier now. But we also still have our job scheduler ability too,
yeah.
to where we can have something run, daily at 10 a.m. or however it is we need to, or trigger a flow to run hourly, whatever we want. We actually even have more options with our scheduler in IPA than we ever did.
Scheduler is super flexible in IPA. Hey, you know what I really like about the scheduler in IPA is I don't have to load up a separate application to set my schedule. It's right there in the It's right there in the rich client.
That's right.
Along with all my other configurations.
Remember the old process flow administration tool?
Yeah.
Now everything is going to be within your rich client and in a much easier to use interface than it was before.
Cool.
And now I pass back to Richard, and we go to.
All right, let's talk a little bit about landmark architecture. IPA is an application that runs in the Landmark application server. Landmark is the platform for next generation applications from Infor for Java-based applications, where LSF is the app server for COBOL-based applications. For many of you, IPA is probably the first chance for you to get into Landmark. There are probably half a dozen different applications from Infor available on Landmark today. Right now, Landmark runs on 2 different platforms. It'll run on AIX, or it will run on Windows. That's it. No iSeries, HPUX, Solaris. I am sure that Red Hat Enterprise Linux is coming soon, but it is not available at this time. I would like to point out that the hardware requirements are pretty significant. So plan on budgeting a pretty good amount of resources for your Landmark server. Landmark can co-locate with LSF or other applications in the Infor universe, but for performance reasons, I would say it's a pretty good idea to run Landmark on its own box. Here I have a diagram of the high-level architecture of the Landmark system. Landmark is powered by an Infor component called Grid. That's Infor's proprietary application server for running Java applications. And then within Grid, I have each of my Landmark applications running. Here you see I've got 2 IPAs because unlike process flow, IPA has product lines. So maybe this is my test server, and I have maybe a test product line and a dev product line. So I'll have 2 different instances of IPA running, one for each of those product lines. The web components, that's like the in-basket and the web admin site, are all powered through WebSphere, which also lives on my Landmark server. And to talk a little bit about single sign-on, how's that work? Grid will be if you have an 80 bind on your Lawson environment, you will bind your landmark runtime to Active Directory as well, and that's how the rich client will authenticate for sign-on. Rich client is your thick client. That's the client you need to install on your computer. In IPA, it's really just for administrators, right?
Exactly.
Like end users typically aren't going to go into the rich client. The end users are going to go into the web user interface, and for that, you'll have more of a traditional single sign-on back with Lawson. So if you're signed in a portal, you're also automatically signed into the web in basket, and content can be served into the browser. It's pretty seamless from an end user's perspective. They won't realize that the in basket's coming off of a different server. Looks pretty cohesive for the rest of Lawson. Whoa. Things got nuts. Let's talk a little bit about some of my favorite things in IPA. Let's start with configuration sets.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, this is definitely a huge improvement over process flow. This ability to separate out your flow configuration from your flow's business logic. So what does that mean? What kind of things would I store in a configuration set?
A great example are your databases.
Oh, yeah.
We were talking earlier about, maybe I'm AIX and Oracle for Lawson, but I need to go out to my internal SQL server. So I can create a configuration set with those JDBC drivers. Now let's say I also maybe have something on DB2. I can create another configuration set with JDBC for the DB2 database. I have two things. I don't have to worry about juggling these drivers. I just use the configuration set.
Yeah.
And
I definitely don't want to put things like JDBC usernames and passwords right within my flow itself.
Absolutely.
Because that becomes a pain if those things need to change. I need to dig through the flow and find where they're set. And oftentimes, those values are going to be different between my test and my production environment. And I really don't want to have two different versions of the same flow, one for test, one for prod, right? It makes it really hard to work through change control if the flow itself needs to be modified when migrating from one environment to another. So configuration sets allow me to bring my configuration outside of the flow logic. The configuration gets stored in the rich client, and it's specific to a product line. So I can have different configuration values depending on what product line my flow is operating in. Up here on the screen, we're taking a look at the properties page. In addition to JDBC, you have this area in the configuration set where you can make up your own name-value pairs that you can use for anything you want. So things like file locations, email addresses, anything that I might conceivably want to change later on and not have to go into the flow to modify.
Let's say I have to go and FTP to a server and I go to a specific directory, and now that's changed on that other server. Previously, I would have to edit my flow and then upload a new version, where now, if I have it stored in a configuration set, I go and update the variable, no change to my flow.
Cool. Done. How easy is it to use these values? It's actually super easy. You can go into as a flow designer. You can be working in your flow, come across something that you think, hey, I could use a configuration set property for this. Let me switch over to the rich client, create a new configuration set property, and enter the value. I switch right back to the designer, and as soon as I hit Control Space, I'm going to see that new property listed in the variables list. So I don't even need to log out and log in or anything like that. It becomes immediately available. So that level of convenience makes it easy to make that a habit as a developer, to consistently use configuration properties. How many configuration sets do you need? Out of the box, each product line is going to come with a main and a system. You can go ahead and use those for whatever you want. If you've got a larger IPA environment, a lot of flows, maybe used by several different functional areas, it could be a good idea to create more configuration sets, maybe one per suite. Configuration set holds the credentials that IPA uses to authenticate back into Lawson to do transactions. I think it's a good idea to set up multiple dedicated loss and service accounts for those transactions. And that just helps with auditing. So you can see, when you see the operator on a transaction, you can tell, oh, that's the process flow user for HR, or oh, that's the process flow user for supply chain. I can tell who it was that, or how did that transaction got changed instead of just seeing loss. The configuration set points to one product line only, so you will need multiple if you want to have a flow that can talk to across product lines for some reason. And an individual configuration set can only have like one JDBC connection too. So if you had multiple databases you want to reach out to, you need a configuration set for each. Moving on, let's talk a little bit about the improved error handling capabilities in IPA. What kind of error handling did I have in process flow? They're pretty much just two options, right? If an error occurred in a node, I could either continue on totally ignoring the error as if nothing had happened, or I can terminate the flow altogether, just end. Neither of those are really optimal. Ending the flow obviously doesn't finish off whatever work it is you're trying to do, and continuing on doesn't really account for handling that error gracefully. With IPA, I have some additional options here. In any node that does some sort of transaction or reaches out to another system that could potentially encounter a system error, I have these built-in options now. I can notify, which means send an email. So it's like having an email node built right into my transaction node. I can add a custom log entry, which allows me, as the developer, to decide what gets written out to the work unit log in the event of a failure. So maybe I could collect all the variables that were in play for this node and write them out, or put a little message to remind myself when I need to troubleshoot this 6 months later what I was trying to do here. I think the most powerful error handling capability is the ability to divert the logic of the flow in the event of an error. So let's take a look at that here. The old way, here I've got like a loss in transaction. I'm doing an add on PA52. And then what do I need to do right after that is have a branch node to check, was that transaction successful? Did we have an error connecting the loss in? Did the screen give us back an error message? Did I have a value misformat or what? And try and handle that gracefully by branching out. In IPA, every transaction node has a built-in branch node, and that's why you'll see two different connections here in the designer. There's the regular connection, and then there's the error connection, which is represented with a red line here. So my flow will automatically divert out to my error handler if there's a problem executing this transaction. All right, so let's take a look at monitoring flows in IPA, another huge advancement over process flow. I was never a fan of that process flow administrator application. I was usually, FTPing to the Lawson server to try and get my work unit logs. Now I can see all that right here in the rich client. So I've gone into my rich client, I've navigated into process server administrator, administration, and work units. This screen is going to show me all the work units in the system. I've got another screen that can show me just the active work units to filter that down. And by double-clicking on a work unit, I can get all this information about what's going on with this instance of the flow. And the most useful of which is the work unit log. So I can access the work unit log right in the screen. I don't need to go out to a separate system. I don't need to FTP or anything like that. If I hit the open button, that'll pop open Notepad with a view of the work unit log. IPA has a administrator website, so if you're not at your desk, you don't have easy access to the rich client, or you just don't feel like running a program on your computer, you can access the stuff over the web as well. The IPA website has pretty much all the capability that you can get in the rich client when it comes to configuring flows and monitoring flows. So here I've got that same work unit screen open. It also has some at a quick glance charts and visuals to give you an overall picture of the health of the system, what percentage of flows are completing successfully versus erroring out. And I touched on this a little bit earlier. We've got a work unit messaging capability. Come on, buddy. Here we go. We've got some work unit messaging. What this is basically an area attached to an individual work unit where I can add messages, sort of like keep a running audit trail or log going on. This information is accessible right within the in basket, and approvers can actually add messages. They can use this to have maybe a rejection reason or something like that. I like to take advantage of it within my flows. I'll do a landmark transaction to add a work unit message to the work unit to basically keep a running trail of what's going on in the flow. Like, this item has been sent to this person for approval, or this person approved this item, or this the approval timed out and we escalated to this other person. Here for this particular client, that became really useful because you know, the system generally will show you the username of who took action, but sometimes usernames aren't clear. Here, this particular client has numeric usernames, and nobody knows anyone else's username, so we needed to make sure we showed real name in the audit log. So we did a query to get out the real name, first name, last name for an associated username, and then inserted that into work unit messaging. Another neat little feature is these variables for reading the output of a node. Just a handy shorthand. So you've got a variable called last return message that is always going to be populated with the return message of the most recent node that you went through. I think it's just a little bit easier than writing the traditional syntax. It also means that your variable here isn't tied to the name of the node. If you want to rename the node or maybe move around the order of nodes, that won't break your variable references. We've got a administrative override capability in IPA. So if I'm an administrator and I have something that's out there waiting for someone's approval, I can go into Rich Client and I can basically take action on that, right? I can reject it, I can approve it, I can do whatever an approver could do. And the way you do that is you bring up the work unit on your main work unit monitoring screen. You go up there to the main actions drop down, say take action, and you would type approve or reject or whatever the action name is. I would caution you that this has to be typed exactly as the action is defined, and case matters as well. What else can I do in IPA? I've got a work unit cancel and restart feature. So for a work unit that's in progress, it's pretty easy through the Rich client to halt that. You can have it restart from the beginning. So if something's gone wrong, or if there is some prerequisite configuration that need to be done, you don't have to ask your requester to go in and resubmit or something. As an administrator, you can restart a flow. So another cool trick you can do is while you're in there restarting a flow, you can modify the process version. Right? So we know that whenever you upload a new version of a flow, any work units that are in progress will continue out their execution on the version of the flow that they started on. Right? You're not going to overwrite the logic of an in-process work unit. Here you've got the ability to do that. So if I have my flow running and it encounters an error, and I say, oh, actually that's a bug in my flow, I need to go into the designer, make a tweak, I can upload a new revision of the flow, cancel the work unit, go in, increment the process version, and restart the work unit, and the work unit will start again on my newer corrected flow. One thing to look out there for there is that the log is not cleared, so it does make it a little bit more difficult to read the work unit log when you do this. And variables might not necessarily reset back to blank or default values. So that can really cause havoc in a flow if you've got variables set to things that you didn't expect them to be set at that point in the flow. So what I generally do is I have an assign node right in the beginning of my flow that blanks out or resets all the variables that I have in play, just to make sure I know what the starting value is going to be. I don't just assume that the start node set everything to blank. Okay, so those are some of my favorite things in IPA. Let's take a look at some gotchas or some pitfalls.
That's the old version of process flow.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so one thing I've run into is if you make use of JavaScript expressions within an assign node, those values don't necessarily get saved after your flow passes through a user action node. So if right in the beginning of your flow you have some complicated JavaScript, maybe like switch statements to do some complex variable assignment or JavaScript formulas, once your flow passes through maybe the first level of approval, you might find that those variables that you had set are now missing. The value is no longer set. The workaround for that seems to be to just use a traditional assignment to set the variable to itself, right? So within my assign node, maybe at the top I have a big JavaScript expression, and I'm looking to set a variable called x. What I do next is I add another assignment right within that same assign node, and instead of JavaScript, I do a regular variable assign, and I'll say x equals x. So that just reinforces to IPA that it needs to persist the value of that variable even through a user action node. Another one related to user action nodes is long strings. We found that really long strings do get truncated when passing through a user action node down to about 1,000 characters. And this comes into play when you look at long, complicated emails out to approvers that might have large tables of of requisition lines or something like that. You've got a huge string of HTML, and that's getting cut off, and you'll see the second approver has an incomplete email notification. So what we do there is we basically just rebuild all those after each user action node. So if we have a part of our flow that's building out the message body for an approver, we'll look at calling that before each and every user action node. And that goes back to my recommendation earlier of doing everything in a loop. That's just one more reason to do that, because you want to try and think in subroutines when you're designing these flows. All right. So let's talk a little bit about implementing IPA. Let's see, what do we need to do to get from process flow to IPA? So IPA and Landmark is no charge for customers that own process flow and are current on their maintenance. You do need to sign a license addendum for that, so contact your Infor account executive to get that process started. Definitely look at doing that. If you're planning your loss intent upgrade, you want to get in touch with your account exec and make sure that you're licensed for all the software. When it comes to how many environments you need, how many product lines you need, I would generally recommend building Landmark environments and product lines to match what you have over on the LSF side. So you have a prod and a test. Look at building a Landmark prod and a Landmark test, and look at probably mirroring out the product lines that you have as well. Product line names need to match how they're defined on the Lawson side in order for the triggers to work. So if you have a product line called test, you need to, on Lawson, you need the same product line called test over an IPA, and that's necessary for triggers to pass through from system to system. Yeah, we have a question. How much longer is it going to be? Just 5 more minutes. All right. So what I'm getting at with this slide is that basically you need to be on Java 7 across the board to run the current version of Landmark 10.1.1. The last version of Landmark that supported Java 6 went out of mainstream maintenance at the end of last month. So this is Java 7, not just on the Landmark server, but on your LSF server as well. So it's a prerequisite on the Lawson 9 side of moving to Landmark at this point, is updating to Java 7 in your Lawson environment, and that's probably going to bring you up to WebSphere 8.5 as well. The reason there is you've got some jar files that you add into the BPM structure in Lawson in order to power this trigger configuration, and those jar files are now only compiled for JDK 7. All right. What can we do to get ready for Landmark IPA? I mentioned the talk to your account exec for licensing. There are probably some environment updates or other prerequisites. Just check the release notes and the install guide for the version of Landmark you're targeting. I would say refresh your test environment. Make sure you have a test environment that's representative of production, not just with application data, but with security as well. The federating Landmark and LSF is kind of a big project, and you definitely want to be able to try out that process in test with generally the same number of users that you have in production. We'll just touch on ISS for a bit. Infor Security Services is a fairly new product. It's been out maybe 2 years now. It is the component that we use to federate Lawson and Landmark. Landmark is an application server. It contains a whole parallel repository of security information that security information needs to stay synchronized with Lawson's LDAP data. That's where ISS comes into play. Happy to talk more about ISS in detail. If you have any questions, just send me an email after. And what are some considerations when doing the process flow to IPA migration? Obviously, your flows and Logan data need to get migrated over. But also keep in mind training is a big part, both for your developers so they can take advantage and unlock all this new potential, as well as administrators who are managing the day-to-day operation of your flows. And then you'd want to talk about your cutover strategy. So in the PFI to IPA migration, you've got a few things that migrate over pretty well, and the flow logic themselves is one of those things. Also, your user, task, and category data. So if you are using tasks and categories over on the process flow side, there's a converter to bring that data over in IPA. But what doesn't convert over automatically, first off, reports, right? Because all that data that's stored in Logan in process flow, that's now going to be stored in the IPA database, and the schema isn't exactly the same. The table names are different, the columns are different. So if you have any crystal reports that maybe show an approval structure or work units in progress, those are going to need to be edited. Also, active work units. So any flows that are in process flow at the moment that you cut over, they don't automatically come up in IPA. They continue to run out in process flow. As part of installing IPA, you do your trigger configuration, and that's where you tell Lawson, hey, from now on, don't start a flow in BPM, connect over to the Landmark side and initiate a flow in IPA. So at the moment that you make that switch, new work units will fire up in IPA, but work units that you have in process over in process flow will continue there. You got basically two strategies. You can run out the work units in process flow, run two workflow engines simultaneously. The other one is the other option is query out what's running and reinitiate it over on the IPA side. All right, so we're closing this up, and we'll leave a minute or two for questions. How can RPI help you? Planning, project management. We do Landmark implementations. We have a lot of experience with that. We do all aspects of the PFI to IPA migration. and we do custom training as well. I would definitely emphasize our custom training. Training is really important, and Infor offers classes. They offer a great class, but it's in a classroom setting using their environment and their data and their examples. We can come out and do a custom training on your environment and actually accomplish something, build some actual workflows that are going to be useful for your organization as a part of the training.
Let's say you want to do an interface. It's a perfect time to do in your training session to learn how to use IPA and to get a working interface going.
Yeah. All right, and with that, looks like we'll wrap it up.
Well, I want to thank you guys. I think that was a great way to kick off the morning here. And we have a few questions. I'm going to ask them in a second, but just a quick plug for any of you that enjoyed this presentation. Very next one at 10 a.m. we have Ms. Melissa Olson, Mr. Jeff House. We're going to be talking about self-service.
10 Central.
I'm sorry, at 11 a.m. Eastern, 10 Central. My bad. So, all right, let's get to some questions here. Okay, question number 1. How do you access the IPA admin website?
Oh, yeah. So there's a link for that. And where do you find the product link for your IPA website? It's in the validation URLs file. So you go on your Landmark server. In the main directory where Landmark is installed, you'll see a couple of HTML files. Those were created during the installation of Landmark. There's going to be one in there that's named after your product line, so it might say like prod validation URLs or test validation URLs. Open that up, and right within there, there'll be the link to the LPA admin website. Once you get that, just save it out, so you don't have to keep going and looking there. Yeah, but that's where to find where it got installed at.
So I got a follow-up here, a two-part question. So let me go ahead and ask them both. The first is Federation mandatory for 10x? Is the first question. But the second one, you know, from the same organization says, do we have to use ISS if we have IPA flows that do the same thing?
Oh wow.
Oh wow.
That's an interesting question. So I will say that the current messaging from Infor is that yes, you must federate Landmark and Lawson, and yes, you must use ISS to do so. That's relatively new. Of course, there's been a federation capability that's been around for a while where Landmark becomes the primary authenticating system using SSO v2. That's how it's documented in the Landmark install guide. But it seems that the trend is definitely towards installing ISS, federating with ISS, and the last that I have heard from Infor is that will be the only supported method going forward. Technically, you can bring up a Landmark server standalone, and IPA will run. You just won't have single sign-on, but it's possible. You can do that. And do you need to use ISS if you already have flows that maybe synchronize the data in between? That's a good question. I don't know. I would say that Lawson has been making a lot of changes to the way security works lately. There is a new ISS version that comes out every month or two. So chasing that with a custom flow it would probably be less efficient than just going with the capabilities that Infor gives you.
And ISS is really a no-charge item that's pretty quick to install, right? The issue becomes in syncing.
Absolutely.
If your flows already have you know, sunk up, theoretically, then it shouldn't be that big a deal to switch over.
Yeah.
So with that, we're going to wrap this up. If you guys attending want to check out any other webinars today, you can find them on our website, www.rpic.com, under events. Thank you very much for your time. Really enjoyed this. Great presentation. A great way to get this started off today. Thank you.
Thanks.